Well, if you're watching the time, it's just gone 9 o'clock. Hello and welcome to the weekend edition of Newsfeed. I'm Lindy Sarame. As you well know, the race for a new leadership in the EFF is on today. It is expected that the party's leader, Julius Malema, may maintain his position within the party. However, it's not only about electing leadership that's on the agenda. The party is also expected to discuss the South African economy as well as the role of the judiciary, among other topics. Well, our news anchor, Kathy Mutlatlana, is at Nasrec covering the conference for us, as well as our various reporters who will be crossing to throughout the course of the day. She's joined by a political editor, Svungalwa, as well as political analyst, Kaya Sitole. Kathy, a very good morning to you. It's over to you in Nasrec. Well, good morning to you, Lindy, and of course the rest of our viewers who are joining us this morning for coverage of the second National People's Assembly of the EFF coming out of Nasrec this morning. Now, of course, as we have this conversation, we'll be taking a look at the various aspects of what's expected to unfold out of that EFF program going into the day. But I'll tell you what, the one topic of discussion right now are questions over whether or not the media should in fact continue to cover this conference. Now, you'd know that the media is often itself not necessarily meant to be the subject of the story, but very slowly we're seeing that become the case. Of course, yesterday, the EFF, when cutting down that list, they had about 600 requests for accreditation, whittling it down to just over 150. And some of those that they have now excluded from the conference, SANEF going as far as calling it a ban of certain journalists from this conference, has been, among others, the Daily Maverick, Amabungani, Scorpio, and some of their investigative units. Now, the EFF had long said, even before the conference, that they in fact did no longer wanted some of the journalists who are part of these entities to come and cover any of the stories because they feel that they have been unfair in their criticism of the organization. Now, of course, you'd remember that many of these journalists, such as Polly van Wyk, Ranjeni Monsami, Sam Soul, have in fact, and Marianne Tam, have been in fact writing critical stories, mostly taking a look at the link between the EFF and the VBS Mutual Bank scandal. They've written multiple reports around not just Julius Malema, but also Floyd Shivambu, some of the entities that are linked to their family members and how they feel, how they believe rather, that VBS money ultimately made its way into the coffers of some of the top leadership of the EFF. You'd also remember that one story that caused quite a bit of a debate earlier on in the year, where Marianne Tam went through the rubbish, as it were, of a house where the delegates of the EFF were staying post the SONA address, and then also trying to highlight the levels to which there may be hypocrisy between what the EFF preaches and in fact what it practices. And again, that was a story that drew much controversy, people having different debates about whether or not in fact it had gone too far and whether it was something that was in the public interest or rather just of interest to the public. Now, we believe that some of the bodies that engage the media today are then having this conversation this morning. Our political editor, Spusiso Ngalwa, is tracking that particular angle for us. Spoo, speak to us then about this raging debate about whether or not, in fact, the media should continue to be at this conference or take a stand as a form of solidarity with those that have been barred from coming here.
Well, Kathy, what cannot be denied is that the EFF are police, and that the decision to ban Daily Maverick, Amabungani and Scorpio was done to actually send a message to other media houses that we need, if the EFF doesn't like the way we cover the news, then they can ban us. What is happening this morning is that there is a debate among editors and among SANEF members to say that how should we pull out of this conference in solidarity with other colleagues. I think there are two issues at hand. One, the EFF started with Daily Maverick, and then that list is growing. It might be Daily Maverick today, and tomorrow it might be us. So I think there has to be a decision that we take there. But two, we also have a responsibility to the public. The reality is that the EFF was voted by over 1 million people, which is 10% of our eligible voters. So I think it is also equally important for us as the media. We can take a stand, but it is equally important for us to portray and to show the EFF for who they are. And I think that the members of the public would be able to see for themselves and discern as to what is happening. So that is how I feel about it. About the issue, you mentioned the issue, for instance, about Marianne going through the thresh. And that became a debate even within the media, because there are people who are totally opposed to it, who thought that she had gone too far. And that goes to show that the media is not a homogeneous block. We see things differently. I mean, I personally do not care how the EFF spend their money, as long as it is their hard-earned money. But if it's public money, sure, but I wouldn't go as far as going into someone's trash.
Kaya, let me bring you in here. I suppose the EFF has long been firing warning shots about the fact that this is a position they were going to take, because they simply feel that if Floyd Shivambu's words last night are anything to go by, that these particular entities are also being used, quote unquote, by a certain cabal or faction within the different political organizations, particularly the ANC, and they believe that if people want to come to this conference, not just as journalists, but as politicians masquerading as journalists, they simply won't be given the freedom to do so. It's a bit of a harsh call, given the fact that ultimately you would have to prove something like that. To the extent that you've not really proven it, it really is hearsay.
Yeah. Look, it's a very difficult issue, because let us face it, we all have to acknowledge that political parties know that the media plays a big role in assisting political parties communicate their message. Because if absolutely no media house was here, nobody would know what happened at the Second National People's Assembly. And of course, that will not work in the EFF's favor, so they need this to be covered. But we also need to be able to then take a step back and ask ourselves how we got here. And I think how we got here is not necessarily the EFF deciding now in 2019 to ban the Daily Maverick, for example. It is really us going back to when Julius Malema was the leader of the ANC Youth League, and that BBC journalist was then hustled out of that particular press conference, because at that point in time it then looked like the media actually didn't have a particular standpoint to say, in instances where we're here to cover a particular conversation and then a politician behaves in such a manner, what do we as the media do, how do we as the media react to it? And I think that probably started this type of idea where the EFF feels like, well, actually it is at their discretion to decide who covers them and how they get covered. That is the first problem there. Now the secondary problem is then we must then go back to the question of, okay, fine, if you're now saying that these media houses have covered you unfairly, you've got recourse. You are able to then say, actually, this story was false. So therefore, you go to the ombudsman, for example, and then you say, actually, we think that these people are misrepresenting the issues. We've got the right to reply, that we were denied, or things like that. So there's always those particular avenues, so which the EFF continuously fails to exercise. So they never actually go and say, this is why the story was false, but they'd rather go through the Twitter timeline and then launch these attacks, which is not particularly useful, because until somebody is held to account for the way they reported on a story, for them matter. Then there's this issue of whether some media players are actually traversing the line between being media people and then political people. And we cannot deny that in this country we definitely have some individuals who seem to be unaware of where the line is between them being journalists, for example, and them being political practitioners. And when you talk about political practitioners, they could be the people that are then trying to promote the cause of one political party or one political ideology. And of course, it creates tensions there where people are saying, well, actually, we want you to come in your capacity as a journalist. You can come in, but when you report, it then sounds like your prism of reasoning, your prism of analysis comes from some particular political angle, and we do not like that. So I think we also have to go back to the media houses and say, look, XYZ, you wrote this particular story. Do you think that this is purely a journalistic angle, or do you then infuse your own political persuasions or your own political viewpoints into the story? Because what that does is that it taints the story, because journalists are supposed to report on facts. Nobody cares for journalists' opinions. In fact, somebody once said to me that journalists shouldn't have opinions. They report on facts, and then analysts and political players will then formulate what they call an opinion. So I think if we need to then go back and say, look at this article objectively, do you think this was simply you reporting on facts, or this was you telling us what your viewpoints are and then infusing into the story? Because then political parties are within their rights to say, well, actually, this person didn't come here with the intention just to report on the story. This person came to this particular conference, for example, to this People's Assembly, in order for them to bolster their own pre-existing conceptions about who we are as a party. So, for example, let us say you invite a journalist to come and cover this conference. We've seen that some of the EFF leaders were being dropped off in X5s and, you know, all these fancy cars. So if that becomes the angle of the story, it then suddenly sounds like, look at them, they're saying they're representing the poor, but they get dropped off in expensive German vehicles at their National People's Assembly. Is that really the substance of the conference here? I personally don't think so, but some people might use that as an angle to start a story. Now, of course, when a person reads that and sees this in a headline to say, oh, look at them arriving in these fancy cars, it suddenly says, oh, wait a minute, aren't these the people that go to Parliament dressed in a particular way, that go to Parliament and say we're representing a particular constituency, and then suddenly that frames the narrative, it frames the way in which we engage with the story. So I think sometimes journalists can write a story and then take a step back and say, when the public sees this, because remember, you must not always assume that the public is homogeneous, as you said earlier on about journalists. When an innocent person reads the story for the first time, and the first thing that you put up there is an X5 dropping off Dalimpofu, for example, or dropping off Julius Malema, what exactly is it that you trigger in a person reading the story? They're like, oh, look at them, X5s. I don't know how I keep using X5s, Mercedes-Benzes, for example, and then oddly that obviously shifts or frames the narrative, and then when people engage with the story, that always comes back to them to say, but the very first thing that I saw here was this thing. So we need to be able to make the media aware that they've got particular responsibilities. Write the story, take a step back and say, but what exactly is the consequence of the way I frame the story, and whether the story really hinges on the substance of either the picture or that phrasing that I've word, because at the end of the day, people still need to know what the facts were, and sometimes we get lost in that.
You know, Kaya, you're raising such an important issue when you say perhaps to fully understand this moment, we have to take a couple of steps back. And I remember being one of the journalists in that room that day when Julius Malema was kicking that BBC journalist out. And one of the questions that we had to answer in the days after was, why did we not leave in solidarity with him? And the reality of the matter is that many South Africans would have wanted to hear what happened after that moment.
Yeah. And that's a big change.
And that's part of the debate that had to be had in the newsroom, because your news editor was not going to ask you, oh, wow, so you just left. They were going to ask, but where's the soundbite? What happened after that? How do we help the public contextualize what has happened? At the same time, of course, there is a level of responsibility that I think we as journalists need to take. Now, that wasn't the only incident. Last night, again, reference was made to ANN7 and how the EFF was one of the institutions or political parties that deliberately took a stance about not allowing ANN7 journalists at their press conferences. And unfortunately, then the president results in part of what we're seeing today. So do you think, Spoo, that there needs to be a greater conversation even around the media, because often the debate happens, but it never reaches some kind of conclusion. It's left up in the air until a scenario like this today, where now the question comes up and everybody has to have a conversation. The conference ends, but there's no real answer about how we tackle some of these difficult issues going forward.
I agree that there needs to be some form of consistency on the part of the media. And also, the media is not above scrutiny. And where the media has to be criticized for the reporting or for the writing, I think there is recourse for all those various parties. But coming back to the issue of the EFF and the greater debate, there has to be that debate as to how do we deal with a situation like this, where we do not sit on the morning of the first day of the conference still to decide whether we want to go ahead or not. I think, as you make the reference to the BBC journalist's case, the issue there was that it was a precedent. It had not been seen. But I think there was recourse in that I think Julius was disciplined by the ANC, and he had to apologize publicly. And from what I understand, he also had to attend anger management classes. Mine would be to err on the side of telling the story. I believe that the public has to see the EFF for what they are, and I do not think that that is lost on the public. They understand the behavior of the EFF. They know how the EFF behaves in public. But us as the media, yes, let's have that discussion.
All right. Well, I think it's a debate then that will continue to take place for a significant portion of the day. We'll be watching then to hear from SANEF if there's any decisive or definitive decision that comes out of them as an organization. Of course, even if SANEF takes a position, ultimately it will come down to individual media houses and what exactly they feel needs to be done in this situation. And the big question there being around the banning and the barring of some journalists from covering this particular conference. Well, let's then move on and get into what is expected to unfold today. This morning, of course, we're expecting to hear from the EFF leader, Julius Malema. He's going to give a state of the party address. He'll look back at some of the progress that they've had over the last couple of years. I tell you what, Kaya, when you look at where the party is today versus where it was 5 years ago, they certainly have made giant leaps as far as growing the party, but it also seems organizationally a lot more structures in place.
Yeah, and I think, in their own reports that they've prepared for us, they always talk about the quantitative and the qualitative growth of the party over the past 6 years, because remember, there is an idea that was conceptualized way back in July 2013. They had their first National People's Assembly in Mangaung in 2014. Mangaung seems to be a place where you launch political parties for some strange reason. And I think what we then really need to really tackle is the question of, in the past 5 years, what role has it played in the political discourse in general, and what role has it played in infusing political activism at the grassroots level? So I think for me the biggest surprise and the biggest talking point was the fact that when this conference was assembled, my first question is how many delegates are coming? And when they say 3,800, that's quite close to the number of delegates that the ANC actually had here 2 years ago. So of course what that might indicate is that never mind what its electoral outcomes are, but at least its prevalence in the different wards and the different districts. In fact, they say in their report that they've got representation in at least 80% of the electoral wards in the country. So of course the fact that the conversation is being had in as many spaces as perhaps the ANC is having conversations means that the EFF conversation is happening at the grassroots level. Now there are big challenges to then say, heading to 2021 and to 2024, how do you then translate that presence in the wards where you've got a councillor or two? How do you translate that to greater political clout, to greater political electoral success when you go to general election and even the local government elections? And I think that's probably the type of thing that we expect that Julius Malema is going to tackle in his State of the Party address, where he says, like, this is what we've achieved in the first 5 years, and also identify the reasons some of those gains were achieved, because we cannot debate the fact that Jacob Zuma was a tremendous asset to the EFF, in that literally
to all political parties, in fact.
Well, look at
opposition parties,
opposition parties. He was supposed to be an asset to the GA, but they've somehow managed to squander that. So Jacob Zuma was a tremendous asset to the EFF, in that for a lot of the things that happened is that they were simply saying that we are demanding accountability, and of course society then said, oh, actually we're able to hold politicians to account, in spite of the fact that we only participate in the electoral process substantively every 5 years. So I think a lot of the EFF's gains were simply based on the basis that they came through as the accountability instrument. So some people said that if they're going to hold those guys to account, and these guys haven't delivered this RTP House I've been waiting for since 1996, then these are the guys that I'm going to support. Now the question is, asset that they can capitalize on, whether it is an ANC leader or whether it is a substantive issue on the ground, be it land, be it economic emancipation. Do they have that type of asset that they've identified to say, we're going to leverage on these things in order to ensure that our popularity and our our grassroots movement as a party multiplies or is amplified over the next couple of years, so that we get better electoral outcomes? So I'm expecting that he's going to at least mention those types of issues to say, what exactly is the plan going forward? And I think the other thing that we really need to watch out for is the question of, you are saying that people must vote for you. So what happens when people vote for you? And I suppose the only template you have now is this coalition structures that they had in 3 municipalities, to then give us feedback to say, in August 2016, this is a decision that we took. What did we learn from that? Would we ever do it again? And if we do it again, would we ever go into bed with the DA, for example? What becomes the parameters? Because I think for a lot of people, that has become a big talking point, because even back in 2016, people were saying, you've just gone into bed with the DA. It's the DA, for crying out loud. So a lot of people felt that, that was a no-go area. area.
But of course,
it became an important thing,
at the time, the DA seemed a lesser evil in the context of a Jacob Zuma. But when you look at what has happened recently in the DA, that shift, especially in as far as it then touches of issues of transformation, of racism, and you know, which one is the bigger evil, really? Corruption or racism?
Literally, you've got this strange conundrum where the ANC presented Jacob Zuma and made him an asset to the EFF, and now suddenly the DA is presenting Helen Zille, and you're looking around and say, well, actually, what exactly is the DA thinking? How does the electorate view these things? Because I think the problem perhaps with the DA is that it sort of tends to operate in some utopia where they're saying, these are our principles and they stick to them. But they never go out and say, so how do people, the electorate in particular, look at what we're doing and what does it do to them? And how does it formulate the engagements with the party? So I do think that obviously for the EFF, now that Jacob Zuma is gone, Cyril Ramaphosa is not as great an asset to the EFF as Jacob Zuma was, because it's very difficult to attack him, except perhaps in the case of ESCOM. But in those particular instances, they then have to say that going forward, this is what we are championing, this is how we're championing it, and of course, this is why we think that you guys need to follow us, we think that you need to support us. So those types of things, we're hoping that they emerge somewhere in the conversation, even in not explicit terms, but for him to give us hints of saying that we actually think that as the EFF, we remain a valid political formation, we remain a valid economic emancipation instrument, because those are the terms that they're using here. They're calling themselves an economic emancipation instrument, and you need to start making those things tangible and say to people that look at what the ANC has done, for example, look at what the DA is doing in Cape Town, you know, marginalizing the poor and the homeless. This is why the EFF is different, and this is why you must support the EFF. So he needs to somehow infuse that into his conversation.
Well, I tell you what, it's definitely going to be interesting to see if they come up with anything definitive, as we have seen in the DA, around how then they engage with other parties going forward. Because, you know, the review conference of the DA said, well, we should not have worked with the EFF. That's something clear from a position. Whether or not they stick to it, of course, is a whole other conversation. Spoo, I want to bring into the conversation here. Kai raises an important issue when in tracking the progress of the EFF, you almost mirrors it against the organization of the ANC. I wonder, do you think that that's by intent of the EFF, or is it something that they stumble upon? Because one can't help that to think about the fact that they could have had this conference anywhere in South Africa, and yet they chose Nasrec. The last time that we were here in Nasrec was for President Cyril Ramaphosa, at least on the scale, was for the elective conference of the ANC. There seems to be some intent there in maybe showing the South African public that, hey, whatever the ANC does, we can do, and perhaps even do better.
Maybe from an organization point of view, you can argue that, but it may just be an issue of convenience as well, in that Nasrec is central and it's easy to organize around here. But I think what is deliberate though, is that the EFF has always wanted to project itself as a better version of the ANC, and also more left-leaning and also more pro-poor than the ANC, in that even in their discussion documents, they always make the point that the ANC does not represent the poor. So I think on that particular note, that would have been a deliberate decision to come to Nasrec. But I want to come to the point that Kaya made about the EFF.
Which point? The scale, 3,800 delegates, NC 4,000, quite close, I think its infusion into the grassroots is something that is, we must comment. I mean, it took the ANC 112 years or 108 years to get 4,000 delegates to come to a conference. The EFF is getting to the same scale.
But here's a point. Here's a point, though. The EFF has made traction. I mean, in terms of the insourcing of workers, they've done the same in terms of free education, making sure that those issues come to the fore. But also, Zuma must fall. I mean, that was basically the EFF's campaign. So I think going forward, it's not just that. What they will be doing going forward, they'll have to find an issue, and I think it rests in those discussion documents. I mean, their first cardinal pillar is around the issue of land. And so land, you can expect that land will be the uppermost on most discussion. Besides the debate from tonight, or whether they are on the nominations and the election, what Julius will want to do walking out of this conference is to walk out of here with a clear mandate and assured that he has the backing and the support of his party as it goes to the 2021 and 2024
And a lot of that is going to have a bearing on how exactly the organization does what it does.
Yeah.
You guys are referencing the cardinal pillars of the EFF, and one of the things that they point out, and I think very unashamedly so, is the fact that they are a protest organization, and that whatever they do is rooted in protest.
Yeah.
Now, you'd find that during the Zuma years, there was a bit of perhaps grace in terms of how the organization was dealing with some of the issues. Most of the South African public, they may not have agreed, but they certainly seem to take a step back.
The ultimate outcome was more important, yeah.
Yes, and let the EFF be.
Yeah.
Now, when you have instances like we had with H&M earlier on in the year, the EFF has been consistent with who they've always said they are as an organization, and yet the South African public is saying, but no, this is too much now.
Yeah.
Stop. You don't always have to protest. You don't always have to cause chaos. And yet the EFF is telling us in their documents that this is who they are as an organization.
I think it's important for us to actually go back and say that sometimes the electorate is inconsistent, and then, you know, they're saying that this was good for us 2 or 3 years ago, but now we no longer want it. But like the political party says, but this is how we've always engaged. And I think if you go back to the issues that we saw in Parliament, those fistfights in Parliament, when you then had Baleka Mbete having to marshal in all those goons of hers in order to get rid of the EFF, at that point in time, people saw these as the people that were fighting for the legitimacy of our democratic dispensation. These were people that were legitimately saying, well, actually, this president who's about to deliver this address is so compromised, we do not feel that it is appropriate for him to do this. And a lot of people said, well, actually, yeah, they're bringing that conversation. And of course, never mind what Jacob Zuma said in that particular speech, the thing that emerged as a talking point was the fact that a political party had to be dragged out of Parliament. Then there was what Mahlobo did in sort of cutting down the signals and all of that. And those are the things that when you emerge...
You're reminding us of the dark times we've been through
yes,
as a country.
Yes. When you say dark times, I think ESCOM, so please don't use those words. So I think at that point in time, the electorate sometimes doesn't take enough responsibility for the things that it accepts and for the things that it concedes to. Because if we were comfortable with the EFF doing that back then, when Jacob Zuma was the president, at what point in time do we then go back to them and say, oh guys, by the way, that mandate was for that particular purpose, was for that particular issue. Going forward, please don't do it that way. Please do it through some documents or some political committees and things like that. So at some point in time, we then have to step back and say, well, how does the electorate actually then say to political parties, this works for us, we're supporting it for a limited lifespan, or this becomes a principle? Because you have to go back, the EFF has been consistent in being very aggressive in their approach. If they could have fights in Parliament, what makes us think that they wouldn't do those things at H&M? Because of course, at H&M they're dealing with what they believed was a very important issue, the racism, perceived or otherwise, the racism issue relating to the picture that was put out there. And of course, going forward, it's difficult for them to then disassociate themselves from what has worked for them in order to then say, oh, now things need to be done differently. And a lot of people, and you know how social media works, then they're going to be accused of being sellouts. They're like, oh, in the past you do this, you did it because it was Zuma, so therefore you hated Zuma. Why are you not being as aggressive when it comes to Ramaphosa, for example? So it's very difficult to please an electorate, unfortunately, and sometimes you have to feel for political parties.
All right, so I want us to then talk about the issue of race and how it becomes a central feature, especially for the EFF. Now, earlier on in the year 2013, this part of being the research that Ipsos had conducted, and mainly around race. Now, the EFF is almost a 99% black organization, so you can see the margins there for any other race groups that are represented being quite minimal. Of course, it's also a majority male party. Only 33% of the constituency of the EFF are females. Let's take a look at what Julius Malema has to say around the extent to which the party has been able to perhaps grow its non-racialism. Even though that's what they stand for, certainly it doesn't seem to be translating into